Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our organizational theory class. My name is Dr. Gabriel Telleria, and I'm very happy to be your instructor for this course. I look forward to it, and I hope that you enjoy it and find it very useful and informative. So, for this first week, we are going to kind of introduce a few concepts, general concepts about organizational theory, and so let's get started, okay? All right, so let's go very quickly through some of the learning objectives that we have for this week, and then we'll start talking about organizational theory. So the learning objectives explain why organizations exist, the purposes they serve, describe the relationship between organizational theory, organizational design, and change, differentiate between organizational structure and culture, understand how managers can utilize the principles of organizational theory and to design and change their organizations to increase organizational effectiveness. Identify the three principal ways in which managers assess and measure organizational effectiveness. Appreciate the way in which several contingency factors influence the design of organizations. All right, so these are the learning objectives that we have on tap for this first week of the class. So what is an organization? Okay, I'm sure that we've all heard at some point, somewhere, in some way, shape, or form, the term organization used in all different areas, right? We use it in our slang, we use it in just talking to people, and we use it in our professional lives, right? In our jobs, and you hear about it. And if you work, you belong to an organization. If you attend a church, you belong to an organization. If you are part of a baseball team or have a local club, you belong to an organization. So, what is an organization? In the simplest form, an organization is two or more people. That is the smallest organizational structure that you can find. Two people, okay? So an organization has many different sizes. It comes in many different sizes, shapes, and forms. The definition that we are going to be using for this course is an organization is a tool people use to coordinate their actions to obtain something they desire or value. So for this class, we think about an organization as a vehicle. It is a mechanism by which individuals achieve something, obtain something, whether it's a goal or an objective or some purpose, okay? So we can think about, as you listen to this lecture now, you can think about different types of organizations, right? So if you have a religious organization, it has a religious purpose, it has a faith purpose, and it has a service purpose. If you think about organizations in government, for example, Congress is an organization, and they have their own purpose. Supreme Court, justices, or lower courts, lower state governments, local governments, and then, of course, in the private sector, any firm, right? IBM, Apple, what have you, right? These are all organizations, and they have a purpose. So organizations have many, many different purposes, and whatever they do so through this organization, right? They organize and in the hope and with the purpose of achieving a goal or objective. Now, sometimes when we think about organizations, it's not just sufficient to have the foundation, right? It's not sufficient just to have a building. It's not sufficient just to have computers or capital or trucks or automobiles or whatever. You need something special. You need that extra ingredient, and that extra ingredient that makes organizations or allows organizations to achieve that goal or objective is often referred to as entrepreneurship. So organizational entrepreneurship is the process by which people recognize opportunities to satisfy needs and then gather and use resources to meet those needs. So it's that skill that individuals possess that makes organizations achieve the goals that they intend to achieve. In fact, sometimes we refer to these individuals as organizational entrepreneurs, right? So that's what entrepreneurship is about. So, how does an organization create value? Well, before we answer this question, we have to first establish a premise here, and that's that value creation takes place at three stages: at the input stage, at the conversion stage, and at the output stage. Okay, so whether it's bringing in a new computer system or a newly acquired technology, right? So that adds value, that generates value to the organization, but it's not sufficient, right? I mean, you bring in a new computer system or new technology, in and of itself, it cannot generate the value, or at least maximize its value by itself, right? It needs to have whatever it does be converted into value. And so the input needs conversion, and the conversion happens with individuals. It is individuals. It is human resources. It is us who are the ones who convert value. So in the input, in the conversion, and then of course the result of using those inputs and converting those inputs into value is the output. So value creation takes place in the input stage, in the conversion stage, and in the output stage. And we can measure value adding or the value creation. We can actually measure in those three different stages. Now, naturally, each stage is affected by the environment in which the organization operates. Because remember one thing, organizations don't exist in a vacuum. No organization exists in a vacuum. And by that, I mean that organizations are subject to external factors, whether they are economic, political, socioeconomic, sociopolitical, governmental, legal, regulative, even as we know, right, even factors that are unforeseen, like a pandemic, for example. So these factors will affect the input, the conversion, and the output ability of an organization to extract and to add value. We refer to some of these factors in the literature and in theory as the organizational environment. Okay, so these are the set of forces and conditions that operate beyond an organization's boundaries, but affect its ability to acquire and use resources to create value. So the organizational environment is central, is paramount to the success of an organization. And that's why in today's world, whether it's the private sector or the public sector, you are looking for individuals who can navigate these really rough waters, these uncertain times, and that are able to handle crises and manage situations in the face of unforeseen events like the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, because we understand now from practice and from the literature that organizations are greatly affected by their environment, and in many cases the environment drives the decisions that individuals within the organization take to be able to continue doing what the organization is intending to do. So here are some examples of how an organization creates value. Okay, so let's look at some of these examples. From the organizational inputs, an organization obtains inputs from its environment. So for example, raw materials, money and capital, human resources, information and knowledge, customer service organization. So this is from an organization's input. So this is looking at the inputs. For example, money and capital, you can think about adding value from low interest rate lending or credit opportunities, right? When you can finance operations with cheap money. So that's one way to add value. Organization's conversion process. How does an organization add value in this stage? Well, through transforming inputs and adding value to them through machinery, computers, human skills and abilities, right? So, we do things now with computers. We also buy, organizations invest in highly technical and highly productive capital, machines. And they add value by creating output that is much more efficient, both in terms of time and in terms of money, or in terms of cost, I should say. From an organization's environment, how do we add value there? Well, that's the critical one, because now we're looking at the ability to understand one's customers, the understanding one's shareholders, suppliers, distributors, government, right, and competitors. So if you think about this from a private sector perspective, it kind of, it's easy to see, right? A company has to maintain its competitive advantage over another company, and so it has to make sure that it continues to satisfy its clients, also satisfy its shareholders, and make sure that its supply chains are not affected. And we know that from our experience currently, we know that is something that can be detrimental to an organization. But from a public perspective, we also have to understand the government impact and the political impacts that can also dictate. They can dictate how efficiently and effectively an organization can achieve its goals. And then from an organization's output perspective, or at the output perspective, an organization has to think about finished goods, services, dividends, salaries, values for stakeholders. Okay, so this is looking at value creation from the output side. How did we do in the company? If it's Apple, for example, Apple computers, did we achieve the dividends? If you're a shareholder, you want to have dividends, right? So was Apple able to pay dividends? Was Apple able to increase its salaries for its workers? How much value was added in that respect? And of course, if you're looking at a public organization, well, what kind of legislative improvements were made? If you're Congress, right? How many laws were passed? What was the quality of the legislative process? How many people did we benefit? What kind of an impact did, for example, the COVID-19 relief, the different acts that were passed by the two administrations, the previous administration and the current administration? What was the impact? What was the economic impact? So this is one way to understand how an organization adds value, looking at it from the output side of things, okay? Now, why do organizations exist in the first place? Okay, so we kind of already answered this question. We said that organizations exist to achieve an objective, a goal, a purpose, okay? But let's look at least, let's look at some of the reasons that the book and the theory gives us as to why organizations exist, okay? The use of an organization allows people jointly, so collaboratively, to increase specialization and the division of labor. So we know, and if you've ever read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and in fact, classical economics is all about division of labor specialization, and adding value and finding a comparative advantage through specializing in something that you do well. And so organizations achieve that by by hiring workers that are experts or who are specialized in one part of the process, and together they are able to produce a product or provide a service at a much more efficient, much lower cost if had they been producing that by themselves. Okay, so increased specialization and the division of labor, large scale technology, so you can achieve economies of scale. We'll talk about that here in a minute by using large scale technology. You are able to manage the external environment much more effectively and efficiently because you have much more access to information and expertise from people. Economize on transactions costs. So the cost of transactions are those costs that we have to incur, or firms or government incurs, to produce or provide a service or a good, right? And so when organizations organize, they economize on the transactions cost because they are able to spread their costs across many, many units, whether it's hundreds or thousands or millions, right? And then lastly, exert power and control. So if you look at political organizations or even nonprofits or lobbying groups, they organize to exert power, exert power, whether it's political or otherwise, right? And so these are some of the reasons why organizations exist, okay? And ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? It's increasing the value that an organization can create, right? Because we can add value. We can certainly add value on our own by doing something, right? We can add value by, for example, giving your time to charity, okay? Helping the sick or the poor or the elderly, right? You can add value. Certainly, that's what God wants us to do, right? But not everybody might be as inclined and as righteous to devote their time and their effort and their energy to doing that. So think about an organization that organizes and gets a lot of these people that would be able to do this or would want to do this together, and that organization is then able to tap into funding streams, tap into networks, collectively gather resources to be able to provide for these individuals in a larger scale. So if you think about the United Way, for example, if you think about CARE, if you think about, I'm trying to think about other organizations that are nonprofits that help folks, goodwill organizations, right? That's what they do. That's their purpose, to help people in a mass scale, and so it increases the opportunity to add value, not only to the organization but also to society. So this is why organizations exist. Now, in this class, this is organizational theory and design. Organizational theory falls within a large umbrella, okay, or encompasses, I guess I should say, an umbrella that includes different approaches or elements of organizational theory, which are in and of themselves, I guess you can call them subcategories or sub-disciplines that are studied within the organizational theory umbrella. So, for example, we have organizational structure, organizational design and change, and organizational culture. Now, one way that I like to think about this, and maybe you can remember that my idea, maybe it'll be good for you, is to think of these as a three-legged stool. Okay, I think I have a three-legged stool here somewhere. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to use this is actually a four-legged stool. But imagine if this was just three legs, right? Three-legged stool, all right? So that's our three-legged stool. Think about these three as organizational structure, design, and culture. So each of them have one leg. And think about organizational structure as systems. Think about organizational design and change as processes. And think about organizational culture as behavior. Systems, processes, behavior. These are three words that are easier to remember as and think of them as the organizational three-legged stool: systems, processes, behavior. If we understand the role of these three within organizational theory, we are going to be better able to understand organizations. So what are, very briefly, I'm not going to read through all of these, but just very briefly, organizational structure refers to the formal, technical part of the organization, the formal system of task and authority relationships, right? The technical tasks at hand. Then you have organizational design and change, and these are the processes that individuals design, implement, and go through in order to achieve what they are trying to do, right? The activities necessary to achieve the goals of the organization. And then the last one, which is organizational culture, is all about behavior. And these are the shared values and norms that are embedded, that control, that shape people, the ethics, okay, the values. This is what underlies and drives the organization and keeps the organization within a cultural and ethical frame. Okay, so systems, processes, behavior. You can think of the three-legged stool as a way to remember organizations. All right. Now, the importance of organizational design and change. Okay, so why is it important to learn, to know these three-legged stools, the three legs of the stool, if you will? Okay, let me very briefly again cover these. The first one, and I believe let me see just to make sure. I think I have four reasons why it's important to know and to understand organizational design and change. The first one is to deal with contingency, and as we said, the better we are able to manage risk, to deal with unforeseen events, the better we are going to be in achieving our goals and objectives. So dealing with contingencies is important. Understanding the challenges that organizations often face, for example, globalization, changing technologies, which happen in the blink of an eye, and then, of course, the political landscape. In the United States, although I say this, right, and we know how difficult the political landscape has been over the last few years in the U.S., but it's not so volatile in the U.S. as it is in other places in the world. And so political landscape does play a huge role in organizational design and change and culture in other parts of the world, much so that it does in the United States. So this design, the first one is dealing with contingencies. The second one is to gain competitive advantage. And what is a competitive advantage, or what is competitive advantage? Well, this is the ability of one organization to outdo another, or one institution to maximize its ability to provide its goods and services over, say, a competing institution. Okay? So the ability of one company to outperform another because it has better people, it has better systems, it has more efficient processes, etc. And often we think about this, the drivers of competitive advantage are your core competencies, right? Manager skills, but also leadership here, which we don't really talk about much in this first lecture, but leadership is essential. Leadership is fundamental to organizational theory. We'll talk about leadership throughout this course. So core competencies, and then strategy. Okay, strategy. Strategy is very important because it allows individuals to plan, to to set a course of action and strategically achieve that course, or strategically implement it in a way that will increase or maximize its probability of achieving success. So you have to be strategic in organizations, and that's one way to gain a competitive advantage over somebody else. The third reason is managing diversity. Okay, so this is why organizational design and change is important, especially in today's world. Right, this is not 1920, it's not, or 1922, it's not 1962, it's not 1982, or even 2002. It's 2022, and the world is changing, and the world has changed, and it's become much, much more diverse, thankfully, right? We all want that. But it does come with challenges, and managing diversity is not simple, and it can derail an organization if you don't have the proper leadership and the proper systems in place to manage that diversity and turn it into an asset instead of a liability. Okay, so managing diversity is a third reason. And then the last one is promoting efficiency, speed, and innovation. Okay, the better an organization functions, the more value it creates. Remember that organizational value is created in the input, in the conversion, and in the output stages, in the phases, right? And so the more efficient you are, the better that you are able to extract value from those computer systems and the machinery and the know-how, the much better able, the much more efficient you are going to be to achieve the objective that you seek to achieve. So we then promote efficiency. We want efficient workers. That means efficiency in terms of time and in terms of money and in terms of output, right? We want to maximize our capacity through innovation, through technological advances, right? So this is what organizations seek to do. And government is no different, right? We in government should use the tools that are at our disposal to be able to provide our governmental services, whether it's at the local, state, or federal government level, using tools like cell phones, right, or technology, and using social media in a way that promotes and supports sound governance, and not the other way around, right? All right. Now, unfortunately, there's always a downside to organizations, and there are consequences to poor organizational design. That's why it's so important to have the systems in place, and the right people, and the right structure and the right culture, because if you don't have that, you run the risk of decline, and organizations do decline. All right. And what happens? Why do organizations decline? What are some of the ways that they decline? Okay. Well, for example, what happens when you have talented employees leaving to take positions in other organizations, right? So think about a baseball team, and for those of you that are baseball fans, think about a baseball team which is a small market team, and so they bring in some really, really talented players, and these players are around for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and they're really good. But once they become free agents, what do you know? They get into the free agent market, and who picks them up? The big market teams, right? The teams with the biggest payrolls. So what ends up happening is you invest all of this capital and in innovation and the know-how and the entrepreneurship into the scouting of these great players, but because you lack the funds, you cannot keep them. And so the organization tends to decline. So this is an example from baseball. But you have examples in in politics, you have examples in government, you have examples in the private sector. For example, Kodak here. Kodak was, I'm sure you guys are much younger than I am. I'm 50, so I still remember a time before cell phones when Kodak was the leader, the world leader in photography. The market for photography was controlled by Kodak in the entire world. And we actually had pictures that your parents or grandparents might have shown you where you had a roll of film and you had 12, 14, or 36 exposures. And then you took them to a pharmacy and you had them developed. Well, Kodak made billions of dollars with that, but they did not foresee the future. They didn't see what was around the corner. They failed to understand the changing technology, and they didn't see the instant cameras coming, or the instant pictures, right? The digital pictures. They didn't see that coming. And their lack of strategy, their lack of vision resulted in the end for Kodak, at least the way that we knew Kodak in the before the digital revolution, the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So organizational decline can happen from talented people leaving the organization, resources becoming harder to find, whether those are resources that are natural resources, or it could be human capital, or it could be financial. The process of value creation slows down or even disappears. So you might get some good people in, but you can't convert them. You cannot develop them, like developing a good player, right? Because you lack the coaching, or you lack the system. So the value creation slows down or disappears. And this, in the literature, often is referred to as organizational decay. In fact, sometimes it's even referred to as institutional decay, where the organization, which has institutionalized, slowly begins to crumble like a decaying or a rotting carcass, right? It begins to decay and ultimately dies. All right? All right, and then last but not least, let's talk about how do managers measure organizational effectiveness. Now, this might seem much more related to the private sector, but we still have management in public sector organizations and nonprofit organizations, so it's still applicable. So how do managers measure organizational effectiveness? Through control and through innovation. Okay, so how they control their external environment. Those that are most effective managers and leaders are the ones that understand the factors that can affect and derail the organization. And then, of course, innovating. Organizations that are stale, that are stagnant, tend to decline, decay, and die. Whereas organizations that continuously innovate are the ones that tend to survive. How do we measure this? Well, simple. Efficiency. Okay. How do managers measure organizational effectiveness? Through efficiency. We develop modern production facilities using new information technologies that can produce and distribute a company's products in a timely and cost-effective manner. So that's one way that we measure organizational effectiveness. And then lastly, all right, the relationship between the type of goal and the purpose of the goal. Okay, this is another way that we measure, and this specifically is important for public organizations and government, because governments don't sell products, right? Governments provide services, and these services are driven not by shareholders or profit maximization, but rather driven by legal requirements and even constitutional requirements. And so measuring effectiveness for public organizations is all about legitimacy. That's the goal of government, is to continue to remain legitimate, okay? Legitimacy is defined as the consent of the governed. The people consent to have government govern over them in exchange for safety, for services, and for everything that government provides for the citizen. And so legitimacy is when the people, the polity, consent to have these individuals elected to represent them. And so legitimacy is one measure of organizational effectiveness when we're looking at public organizations. So in summary, okay, to summarize, I know this is a little small. So to summarize, organizations are a tool people use to achieve their goal, right? That's why we organize, to achieve a goal that we have in mind. We study organizations through organizational theory, and this is how organizations functions and how they affect and are affected by their environment. Remember that organizations don't exist in a bubble, so they are affected by the external environment. And then lastly, the importance of managers to monitor and to lead organizations to maximize their resources to organizational effectiveness, okay? All right, so that's our lecture for today. I hope that you enjoyed this first week of lecture. I'm sure that you're going to have a great week. I'm sure you're going to do very well in our first assignment. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me via email or via WhatsApp, and I'd be more than happy to answer any question that you might have. And I have nothing more to say except I wish you a great week, and God bless you all. Thank you very much.